Okay, so I'm hoping this works. I'm trying something new for the first time, so I'm hoping this goes out to everybody, and I think that it is. So welcome to Unbridled Medicine TV. I had an idea last week that I wanted to do like a TV channel basically, and the intention behind that is I have a passion in helping other women claim their medicine and the containers that hold them in the world. And I wanted to be able to create a place where I can share with my community on some places of how we do that, you know, for those that are kind of interested or on that journey. In terms of our current landscape, I think that now is a really wonderful opportunity for us to be out there in the world and sharing our gifts. So whatever ways that I can to sort of support my community in doing that, I wanted to do so, and so hence came this idea. A little bit about me, if you're first being introduced to kind of who I am and where I speak from. I have been navigating this journey of being a entrepreneur since 2011. And my entry into that space was I wanted to do something purposeful with my life. And I had a dream of having my own center and creating my own programs with horses. And I, in 2011, was in that place of like, I had sort of been doing it part-time on the side, and I felt like it was time for me to take the leap and see if I could pull this off and do kind of this work full time. And so I found a property to lease. I grew my herd of horses from 1 to 5, and so began the journey. It's 2020, and now I run my own facility. So I have an 80-acre retreat center just north of Kamloops, British Columbia. I have a herd of 29 horses, and I mentor other women in the space of their business and around this concept of medicine, which I'll be deepening around the series. I run retreats, and I train people to do what I do with horses. So there's sort of a range of ways that I kind of support my medicine in the world. I found, you know, through my journey, and I think where I wanted to share the space too is how do we kind of navigate and create our success in a way that feels good to us and that doesn't create burnout. I have a little bit of a more kind of an intuitive and spiritual way of doing things. I think that we can both successfully create space for purpose and also create a successful business. And I like to be able to support that pathway of how we do both. To talk a little bit about the concept of medicine, it's not a word that I made up. It's a Native American philosophy that I kind of resonated with. I'm just noticing that my live stream ended, so that's okay because this is recording, so I can share it on another platform as well. So I really resonated with the whole concept of medicine and, you know, around what that kind of connected to. So medicine is a Native American philosophy, and basically it is the idea that everything in life has medicine, you know, trees, plants, animals. And I really loved the idea of that. And I connected that in terms of what I believe is as us as well, as we have a unique medicine that we bring to the world. And I know that one of the challenges, or I've witnessed in terms of one of the challenges for me was, I think, finding a way to feel unique in my work and also a place to anchor so I can support, you know, what I'm building in life. And I never really identified with this whole business idea, but the whole concept of I have medicine to share with the world really resonated with me. And I find that it does with my people too. And so what I believe is we find what our medicine is in life. And that is what we share through our offerings. And we also then claim our medicine, because when I first started out this kind of concept of supporting people around this idea of medicine, it was all about helping people identify what their medicine was. And then what I found was that really wasn't enough, because we can know what our medicine is, and that's almost the easy part. And the harder part is then how do I then go and share it with the world? And I think that that's the place that can often get sticky for us, because we bump up against our you know, belief systems and fears and doubts that will self-sabotage, and we don't put ourselves out there. And that's one of the, I think, the core essences of my work is helping people overcome the places where we sabotage ourselves, or we get so rooted in fear that we're unable to then go share our gifts. And then also, again, kind of introduce this concept of our business and what we're creating can really be connected through this idea of sharing our medicine. And that's really what it can be about. So that's sort of a little bit of a background. As I go through the series, I'll be able to deepen kind of that concept and idea for you guys, so that you can identify with that, or maybe it supports in what you're creating. I know for the people that already follow me, there's already a connection point to what that is. So what I wanted to talk about today is this. And I'm just exiting off a conversation with one of my clients, and this was basically the bulk of our call, and it very much connected to what I wanted today to be about. And that is what I call kind of internal landscaping. And I think that fundamentally and foundationally, what fosters our success is not often the external pieces of, the business structure, but often of our own kind of inner realm. And so I kind of call that landscaping. For a reference or a metaphor in gardening, when we have a garden, we have to landscape in terms of we have to pull out the weeds or else the flowers don't grow, and tend to our gardens that are in our external world. And our inner world is very similar in terms of we also have weeds and places that we have to landscape within ourselves, because we are the vessels of everything that we create. So if our internal landscape isn't clear, it's really hard for us to grow anything. And I think that what often stops us from taking action and creating is ourselves, very much so. So I wanted to kind of introduce this kind of concept of internal landscaping. In any of the programs that I run or the work that I do with my clients, I always start here, because I know that if we're not clear and if we don't have an internal alignment, it doesn't matter the clarity that we get externally on how that goes. We're not going to create any movement. So movement really comes from within. One of the things that I have found that has been essential to this idea is creating a space for myself to be supported internally, having ritual and practice, and being able to know which voice that I want to listen to and cultivate the connection to a voice that is not my fear. When I studied to do my work with horses, we learned about the concept of the false self versus the authentic self. In coaching, it was the saboteur. So this idea that we all have a, internal mind chatter that is not sort of sourced from an authentic place, whether you want to call that your soul or your higher self. Sometimes I like to use archetypes around, my inner wise woman, that the voices that we often listen to or we identify with is the false self. So the core aspect of this concept of internal landscaping really begins with understanding and identifying the different voices that we have within us and where we let them rule. And this is something that we often are not conscious about, right? And I think that it's also something as human beings we have to consistently be supporting. So sometimes we have this idea, I think, that we just have to do things once, or we don't have to be consistently practicing this work. I would consider myself somewhat having an element of mastery around, identifying the authentic self and this whole concept, because I teach it and I practice it. And I still have to hold space for it, because as human beings, our default is often to listen to the false self. And so what I want to introduce you guys to is the importance of knowing these two voices, and also supporting ritual in our world. So again, when I start to work with any of my clients, and whether this is group or whatnot, this is the place that I begin in terms of having us observe the voices that are occupying ourselves internally, and what is the most dominant voice that we have. For most of us, if we don't kind of pay attention to this, or we're not tending to this, it can be the voices of the shoulds, or who am I. I had a really brilliant conversation with this client this morning, and some of these are universal. And we talked about the space of where that voice can really occupy, I'm not worthy, who am I to do these things? We talk about how for her, and I resonate with this, the manifestation of ego kind of appeared as a way of like not owning who we are because that feels too big, or we might push up against somebody else, or we don't want to outshine anybody. So what I offered to her and what I'm offering through this is for us to be conscious of what we're identifying with within ourselves and noticing what voice, again, really occupies a lot. And so how do we do this is we first sort of observe ourselves and our thoughts of what are we thinking and what is the dominant kind of essence within us that is really leading our lives forward, and where does it come from? Because again, a lot of the times we don't challenge or question that. You know, we kind of just go along with what our thoughts are. The whole concept of like the false self and the authentic self is the false self is a voice that lives in our mind. It often speaks the words of what we've picked up in our society, in our family, with our peers. It's not super empowering. It's often very limited and negative, and can make us feel sort of contracted. So I know when I'm in my false self is I'm kind of feeling, you know, having small thoughts about who I am. I'm sort of fixated on the limitations that are in my world. I feel contracted. You know, there's sort of this element of I feel constricted in myself. And I'm not really, you know, feeling motivated or inspired. And in fact, I'm probably questioning and worrying about a whole bunch of stuff or not feeling adequate. So the false self, again, it's not really the soul or essence of who we are. And I think that is one of the things that is often so illuminating for people is that, oh, wait a second, this voice that I kind of think that is me is not me, and I'm identifying with that. So the first sort of practice or concept I want to offer to you guys is in that observance of watching yourself and see if you can identify who is your false self and what is that voice, and to also kind of separate that voice isn't who you are. But what we do is we identify with that. So what I offered again to my client today is that awareness piece of where you're identifying with your false sense of identity. And again, when we're operating through our false self of identity, that's where we're going to sabotage, or we're going to create through the space of limitation. On the flip side of that, our authentic self is rooted in wisdom. It's rooted in a place of our soul or our spirit, or sometimes in nature, you know, where we find that. Our authentic self speaks in simplicity, whereas the false self has a lot of story, which I kind of didn't go into a little bit, so I'll just backtrack. The false self will often have a story attached to, well, if I do this, this is going to happen, without really having lived an experience or really have a knowing of what's going to happen. So we all know I make up stories all the time. That is the false self. The authentic self is often subtle. It's simple, lives in the present. It's empowering. It feels spacious. I often notice that it's like my soul or authentic self speaking through me because it feels like it's more grounded in my body and not just my head. It's supportive. It speaks in possibility and in sort of a grounded perspective that offers sort of an expanded place of awareness. So where we're given a perspective that is not just kind of tunnel visioned. It's kind, it's loving, it's peaceful. So there's a different quality to it. Our authentic self is rooted in the place of our soul, or often the divine, you know, for us to have a connection to. I believe there's a greater energy that supports us, so that voice that I want to listen to comes from that place. And it is the one that sort of fosters our dreams and our visions and our potential. So one of the things that is a really important practice for me in terms of building a muscle, and that I'm offering through the first episode, is we want to cultivate an intentional relationship with our authentic self. And for most of us as human beings, we default to the false self, right? So we have a thought, something happens, and we just follow that thought that sometimes is more, again, negative or has story, without really questioning what's happening. So part of my daily practice is a couple things. I'm observing my thoughts. And when I find myself in kind of this negative pathway, I'm asking myself, what is the perspective of the authentic self? And I'm intentionally cultivating a relationship with that voice, because I want to really be leading more dominantly through that part of me and not through the false self. Now, the goal of this work isn't going to be 100% authentic, because we're human beings and that's impossible. But, you know, if I'm living, let's say 60% through the perspective of my authentic self, then that's a win, you know? So we want to create a more dominant space where we're leading through that place of wisdom. What sort of helps me cultivate that voice of authenticity is I like to kind of create a persona or an archetype of, if I could imagine or visualize my authentic self appearing to me, how would she appear and what would be her embodiment? You know, I often will associate that to a goddess that maybe I really connect to. So the goddess Epona, who I've kind of called myself, or my retreat center is Epona Rise Retreat Center. I often will visualize the goddess Epona, or even one of my horses, as a way to kind of give me a place to connect to. And then it's almost like I have a conversation with her of, what's your wisdom to me, and what's your perspective, and how do you feel about this situation? And so I'm sourcing out that voice within me on a daily basis. What's important about that, just from a physiological standpoint, is we have pathways, neuron pathways in our body and in our brain. And for most of us, our default pathway is to listen to the false self, right? To go to that mind chatter. And that's the default of most humans. When we cultivate a relationship with this other voice inside of us, we're actually developing a neuron pathway in our body and in our nervous system that gives us another place to go, right? To seek out wisdom. That pathway doesn't get created unless we choose it, right? So it doesn't just magically appear. We have to have a practice around that. So for me, that sometimes looks like journaling, or just taking time to meditate and asking my authentic self, or just with that intention of, if I could connect to this persona of my authentic self, what would her perspective be, and what's her belief systems in relationship to what I'm creating, and really familiarize myself with that energy in myself. And the more that I choose that, the easier that becomes. So kind of the first step in this is, we first identify the false self and the authentic self, and observe ourselves and where we occupy a lot of our time. I really like spending time with, like, identifying the authentic self, what her belief system is, and then creating some type of a ritual or process where I can tune into her in my day. If I have something I'm worried about, or I'm freaked out about a situation, you know, whether this is personal or business, my first instinct is to now seek out, okay, I want to create a little bit of stillness and seek out the perspective of this deeper place of wisdom, so I don't get caught in my false self. So you actually want to intentionally seek her out. Where this is connected to, let's say, internal landscaping, when we live in the false self, it's like having a garden full of weeds. And that the energy of kind of what weeds are symbolic of, that's what's leading our life. When we're choosing the place of the authentic self and doing this practice, we're like weeding our garden and creating a really beautiful space where we can find clarity, and we listen to wisdom, and we have the courage to cultivate the action that we want to take in our external world. So courage comes from within. You know, action, ideas, creativity is sourced from cultivating this relationship. Our false self doesn't often live there. So if you're somebody that predominantly lives in the false self, which again, most humans will be navigating that, it's hard to source anything out there, because that's not where the pathway of that creativity and resourcefulness come from. So developing a relationship with this part of you is really powerful. It sounds simple, but I would say the effects of it are profound. And so this is the starting point of the foundation for me in my own practice, and with my clients as well, is I want to know intimately and develop an intimate relationship with my authentic self, because that's the part of me that I want to lead my life. So if you could pick a symbolism or create a persona around this part of you and how she wants to speak to you, and what she feels like, and spend time with her every day, you would start to feel a change and a shift in terms of your ideas, or your courage, or your capacity to have vision and to move forward on that, because you have a different energy that's leading you forward. So it's a really powerful practice. And the thing that I also wanted to create around here too, and I'll share kind of a little story, and then we'll have that be complete for our first episode, where I really noticed the importance of this, what I'm talking about, is through actually the abandonment of it. So when I had a point in 2014 where my business wasn't doing very good and I had a lot of debt and I was struggling with a lot of insecurity. And I realized that, you know, one of the things that was going to shift that for me was I needed to do a better job of how I tended to myself. So I didn't really have any practice or ritual. You know, my thoughts were rampant in negativity, and I knew that I had to change that. And so I got very devoted to having a practice of, you know, meditation and journaling and this exercise that I just gave you in terms of how do I connect to this part of me. And I was like devoted to that practice. You know, I had a morning ritual and I had an evening ritual, and it gave me a really solid foundation of having a consistency of creating or connecting to this part of me. And then things shifted dramatically in my world in terms of my business exploded. And I'm going to share, like, you know, through this series, you know, different pieces of that as well. But I'm starting here in one component because it's not just one thing, but this was a big part of it. And it opened up so much that I found myself in a position to buy the property that I'm on, an 80-acre retreat center. And I moved to this property and it was incredibly stressful. I think I was naive to think that it was no big deal to kind of expand my life exponentially in so many ways. And what happened was the first thing I abandoned was my ritual and my practice. And because I felt like I didn't have time and there was so much to do, I was so stressed, I couldn't afford to create space to meditate. You know, that story where we get really busy. And so I let it go. And my mental health like went into the toilet. I found myself in a really dark place, and it was really a difficult, it was a very difficult place to be. And I didn't really shift anything completely until I actually got trampled by one of my horses because I wasn't listening to that message of, you know, taking time to be still. Because of that story, I don't have time. And I know for some of you, and I know for many of my clients where we have children and we have jobs and we have responsibilities. And so the thought of taking space for ourselves, even if it's just 15-20 minutes, sometimes feels like overwhelming and like I can't. And, you know, one of the things that I really believe in, and I know that is really powerful, is we must, and it's essential. You know, the same that we brush our teeth and we eat and we put on clothes, the space that we create for ourselves, you know, and that internal connection is as equally as important. And it doesn't have to occupy a lot of time, but I abandoned that. And that was really a lesson for me of how essential that was. And so I rededicated myself to that ritual. And my ritual sometimes changes throughout my day. I probably will do a whole separate video on ritual itself. But it's an important practice for us to have, is that self practice of tuning inwards, of finding that connection to our deeper place of wisdom. Because if we don't create that pathway, and our false self is going to take over. And then we're going to find ourselves in a really kind of challenging place, you know, where we're, I think another, perspective of the false self is victimhood, where we feel like we are the victims of our lives and we don't have another place to source out. And we can't source out that wisdom until we create a pathway for it. And creating a pathway for it means we create the space and time to tune in and to connect. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it's really important time. And that's how we you know, tend to our internal landscape, right? It's like the same with our gardens. If we don't tend to them, they grow and they become consumed with weeds. And so my invitation for you guys in terms of this introduction to this new space or TV that I'm offering is spend some time with what is my false self and who is my authentic self. And be intentional about sourcing that part of you out. I will tell you the best way to overcome your mind chatter is to connect to the part of you that doesn't hold that, you know. So we can spend a lot of time trying to figure out, why do I have these thoughts and where does that come from? But I find the most effective way is to hang out with the part of us that doesn't live there. And to spend more time with that part. Think about all of the places that help you connect to that part of you, you know, to make it easier. Again, I offered an idea of creating a persona of your authentic self. Sometimes for me, listening to certain music, going outside in nature, being with my horses, that cultivates that relationship. And then you can ask that part of you, what ritual does that part of you want you to create in your life? And how does that look right now? And maybe that's journaling or meditating every day or a movement exercise. And then what self-practice can you commit to and devote to over the next let's say 30 days, because it does take time for us to build the muscle to that. I shared with my client this morning, you know, where she offered, like, what if I have resistance? And one of the things that I offered to her is this: the purpose behind our internal landscaping or ritual or practice really comes from how it serves us, and to make it really selfish, you know, in some ways, because sometimes doing it for other people, you know, for her, there wasn't that motivation of, I'm going to do it for my business. It really needed to be from a place of doing it for herself. And there was almost a place of, can it be just for that? And yes, it can. So I want to feel, in my own experience, I want to feel happy. I want to feel like I'm grounded in a wise place. You know, I want to feel internal fulfillment. So there's a quality of what I want and how I experience life that is just for me. And that leads to, you know, often the impact of that is, you know, success in our business or whatnot, or fulfillment in our relationships that we're creating, but it starts from within. So having a purpose behind, why is it important for me to create the space for myself? And think about, how does it feel in yourself right now? Does it feel good? Is it a hard place to be? Do you find yourself craving that deeper place of connection because it's not there? So you can kind of ask and reflect that way of, where am I currently feeling, and what is it that I really yearn for in terms of how I'm feeling within myself? And knowing that when I cultivate that space within me, a whole world opens up, right? So if you've lost your inspiration or creativity, if you don't have a sense of purpose, it's not often found out there, it's found within. And starting with that relationship with self, and everything is built from there. So it's a really important practice. This is how I hold it, this idea of internal landscaping, because it really helps to remind me that this is a constant practice. It's not something I just do for a period of time and then I stop. But I know that in this way of being, because it is a way of being, that I'm cultivating the potential to live a life that feels deeply fulfilling for me, and that I feel at home within myself, so that there is that connection, and I can know that I can rely upon myself to source out my creativity and my inspiration and my purpose. And when I have that clear channel, I don't have to worry about what's happening in my external world, because I know that comes from within. So it's a really deep and powerful practice. So that's what I will offer to you for our first episode. Questions, comments, you know, feel free to comment below. I'm going to be posting this on my YouTube channel. If you find this helpful and you want to share to other people, please do so. If you want to follow me a bit more in terms of being able to get exposed to some of my work, you can find me on Facebook under Hillary Schneider, or Women Who Run with Horses. I also have a Facebook group, Epona Rising Women Circle, and I'll add these links under here too. And then, of course, you can look at my website, hillaryschneider.com. Okay, so I hope you enjoy it. That's episode 1. If you have questions or comments or things that you would love for me to talk about, please add them in the comments, or you're free to get in touch with me, and we will see you on the next episode.